The judge's voice was cold, indifferent, final. I hereby order the immediate arrest of the defendant. The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with disbelief, with injustice. A young black girl stood at the center of it all, her hands trembling at her sides, her heartbeat pounding in her ears like a war drum. She had done nothing wrong. Nothing. And yet, here she was, sentenced, condemned, thrown away like she was worthless. Because of her skin. Because of their power. Because they could. She had walked into this courtroom expecting fairness, expecting justice. Instead, she was met with cruelty. The accusation? Shoplifting. A crime she never committed. A crime with no evidence. A crime built on nothing but the color of her skin and the assumptions of people who had already decided she was guilty before she even spoke a word. She had gone into a store like any other teenager, browsing, looking at things she could afford, things she had the right to look at. But a security guard had followed her. He watched her every move. And when she picked up her phone from her pocket, his voice had cut through the store like a whip. "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" She had turned, confused. "Excuse me. Drop what's in your pocket." "My phone." But it didn't matter. It didn't matter that she had money in her wallet. It didn't matter that she had nothing but her own belongings. It didn't matter that she had never stolen a thing in her life. Within minutes, she was surrounded by store employees, people whispering, staring, shaking their heads as if they knew she was guilty before she could even defend herself. The police were called. She pleaded, she protested, she begged them to check the cameras. But no one listened. And now she was here. In court. Standing before a judge who didn't even look at her. "I didn't do anything," she whispered. The judge leaned forward, his eyes sharp, filled with something cruel. "Then why are you here?" Her stomach twisted. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, suffocating her. The prosecutor smirked, feeding the courtroom lies, painting her as a repeat offender, a troublemaker. They twisted her life into something ugly, something that didn't belong to her. The security footage. It conveniently went missing. The store clerk's testimony. Oh, I must have been mistaken, but still, they wouldn't drop the charges. And the judge? He had made up his mind before she even walked in. "You people," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head like she was already a lost cause. Always playing the victim. The words cut deeper than a knife. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear the walls of this courtroom apart, to make them see her, hear her, believe her. But no one would. Because in their eyes, she wasn't a person. She was a problem to be solved. And now, she was going to jail. "Take her," the judge ordered. The bailiff stepped forward, handcuffs gleaming under the courtroom lights. No. No. Her mind raced. Her body froze. She wasn't going to let them do this to her. Not like this. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone. The same phone they had accused her of stealing. The phone that was hers. She dialed one number. The only number that mattered. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's happening." There was silence on the other end. And then, steel. Pure, sharp, deadly steel. "I'm on my way." She barely had time to breathe before the doors to the courtroom exploded open. And what happened next? Let's just say, the judge's life was never the same again. Before we dive into today's story, let's make something clear: Plow of Twist stands against all forms of racism. We believe in justice, equality, and the power of storytelling to shed light on real issues. To everyone watching, especially our Black viewers, know that you are seen, valued, and powerful. This story isn't just entertainment, it's a reflection of the injustices too many have faced. But as always, karma is coming. Stay with us for this shocking twist. Now, enjoy the story, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's get started. The fluorescent lights in the courtroom buzzed faintly, casting a dull, artificial glow over everything, the polished wooden benches, the impassive faces, the air so thick with quiet hostility it felt suffocating. At the center of it all stood Imani Carter, 16 years old, dark-skinned, tall for her age, her natural curls pulled into a neat bun as if she had hoped that looking presentable would make a difference here. It didn't. Her wide brown eyes, full of intelligence and quiet strength, now flickered with disbelief, with fear, with something deeper, a profound sense of betrayal. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. She had woken up like any other day, gotten dressed, tied her sneakers, kissed her mom on the cheek, and left the house with the simple intention of going to the mall. A normal Saturday. A day to breathe, to laugh, to escape the mounting pressure of school, of expectations, of the heavy burden that came with being the daughter of Damian Carter, one of the most respected federal agents in the country. It was a reputation she never asked to carry, but one she lived under, always reminded that her last name meant something to the world. She had walked into the store that day with nothing but time to kill, wandering through aisles, running her hands over fabrics, checking price tags, feeling a quiet pride that she could actually afford things she liked. She had worked hard for her money, tutoring kids at school, saving every cent. It was a small thing, but it mattered. She had picked up a jacket, held it up against herself, imagining how it would look, maybe even picturing her father nodding approvingly when he saw her in it. Then she felt it. The stare. She had ignored it at first, pushing past the discomfort. But it persisted. That subtle, watchful presence pressing against her back like a weight. When she turned, her stomach clenched. A store security guard, white, built like a bouncer, stood at the end of the aisle, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, watching her like she was already guilty. She swallowed the instinctive anger rising in her throat. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. She took her time. Moved carefully. Deliberately. Let him see that she wasn't doing anything wrong. But then came the moment that changed everything. She reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone to check the time. The movement was casual, unconscious, the most normal thing in the world. And yet, hey! The voice snapped through the air like a gunshot. Her head jerked up. The security guard was striding toward her, his eyes alight with something ugly. Drop it, he barked. For a moment, she just stared. What? Drop what's in your pocket. Confusion crashed over her. It's my phone. She held it up, blinking. But it was already too late. A store clerk appeared from nowhere. Another employee whispered something under their breath. And suddenly, it wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was an accusation. A crime. A scene. The words came fast, stacking against her like bricks in a wall. I saw her take something. She was acting suspicious. We've had a lot of thefts lately. Her voice was small, strangled in her throat. I didn't take anything. But nobody was listening. Minutes later, the police were there. 2 officers. One young, one older. They asked no questions, made no attempt to see her side. The security footage? Oh, the cameras were down. Witnesses? We'll sort that out later. Then came the moment that sealed her fate. You fit the description, the officer muttered as he pulled out his cuffs. Imani's breath caught. Her stomach dropped. The description. She knew what that meant. She had seen it before. Heard about it 1,000 times. It wasn't her they saw. It was every black girl before her who had been labeled a thief, a liar, a problem. She had begged them to check again. Asked them to call her father. Tried to stand her ground. But they had shoved her into the back of a police car like she was nothing. And now, here she was. The courtroom was a cold, merciless place. The judge, Robert Calloway, was the kind of man who had long ago stopped seeing people in front of him. He saw cases. Files. Numbers. He had sentenced thousands in his years behind that bench, and he didn't lose sleep over any of them. To him, Imani was just another statistic. Another name to add to a docket. Another face that blended into all the others he had condemned. He didn't see the fear in her eyes. He didn't care that she had never been in trouble a day in her life. He didn't care that she had dreams, plans, a future. All he saw was a young black girl standing before him. And he had already made up his mind. The defendant is charged with theft, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct, the prosecutor droned. Flipping through his papers like this was just another boring case to get through. Imani sat frozen, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Her public defender, a tired-looking man who had barely spoken to her, mumbled something under his breath, but she wasn't listening. She was staring at the judge. Judge Calloway sighed, rubbing his temple. Is there any substantial evidence being presented today? Silence. A beat. The store clerk cleared her throat. Well, no, but she was acting suspicious, the security guard cut in, his voice firm. The judge glanced at Imani then. That look. That condescending, tired look like she was just another troubled kid wasting his time. His next words sent ice through her veins. I see no reason to delay. Given the circumstances, and the history of repeat incidents like this, I order immediate detainment. Bailiff, take her into custody. The room tilted. The air vanished from her lungs. No. The words didn't make sense. They weren't real. She hadn't done anything. But the bailiff was already moving. Handcuffs glinted. The walls felt like they were closing in. Her pulse thundered. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. She had to do something. Her fingers fumbled for her phone. She barely registered the gasps from the courtroom, the disapproving glares, the way Judge Calloway's lip curled in irritation as she dared to move. She dialed. The line rang once. Then, Dad, she whispered, her voice barely holding together. It's happening. A silence. A beat of stillness. Then, her father's voice, calm, low, deadly. I'm on my way. She barely had time to process the words before the doors exploded open. And in that moment, everything changed. The moment the doors burst open, a ripple of shock shot through the courtroom. The low hum of murmurs rose into a wave of gasps as Damian Carter strode inside, his presence commanding, his expression carved from steel. His tailored black suit was crisp, but it did nothing to soften the raw authority he carried. 6'2", built like a man who had spent a lifetime in the trenches of justice, eyes as sharp as a blade and just as merciless when provoked. The moment his gaze landed on Judge Robert Calloway, the room turned ice cold. Imani's breath hitched. She had never felt more relieved and yet more terrified at the same time. Because when her father moved like this, with that quiet, calculated fury, someone was about to regret everything. The judge's mouth pressed into a thin line, his gavel tightening in his grip. Sir, this is a courtroom. You cannot simply, sit down. Damian's voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It sliced through the judge's sentence like a bullet through glass, leaving jagged silence in its wake. The bailiff, who had been inches away from cuffing Imani, hesitated, looking at the judge for instruction. The officers stationed near the exit instinctively straightened, their hands twitching toward their radios. They knew who Damian Carter was. Everyone did. Judge Calloway's nostrils flared. You are interfering with court proceedings, Mr. Carter. That is a federal offense. You want to talk about federal offenses? Damian took another step forward, eyes locked onto the judge like a predator sizing up its prey. Let's start with wrongful imprisonment. Let's talk about due process violations. Let's talk about the civil rights case I'm about to file against you personally. The entire courtroom froze. A weight settled over the space, suffocating, dense. Even the prosecutor, who had been smug and detached this whole time, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Imani watched, her pulse racing, her fingers curled into fists against her lap. She had never seen her father like this in a courtroom setting. She had seen him command FBI teams, seen him negotiate with criminals who had nothing left to lose, seen him tear down entire criminal networks with nothing but strategy and unshakable will. But this was different. Judge Calloway recovered fast, straightening his back. Your daughter is facing serious charges, Mr. Carter. I understand your concern, but she was caught doing nothing. And you know it. Damien's voice was sharper now, more dangerous. Where's the security footage? The judge hesitated. A beat too long. Imani's stomach twisted. That was it. The hesitation. The tiny pause that said everything. That confirmed what she already knew. There was a flicker of something on Calloway's face, frustration, annoyance, fear. The footage is unavailable at this time, he said, his voice measured, controlled. But we have eyewitness testimonies. Damien's smile was razor-sharp. Eyewitness testimonies from store employees who already decided she was guilty the moment she walked in. He let the words sink in, let them slither through the courtroom like a slow-moving fire, burning through every excuse. Because I already checked. That footage. It existed. Until it didn't. Until someone made sure it disappeared. The prosecutor shifted again, flipping through his papers with too much urgency now, like he was hoping to find something, anything, to counter what was unfolding before him. Judge Calloway's grip on the gavel tightened. This court does not operate on speculation, Mr. Carter. Your daughter was seen by multiple witnesses who can't seem to agree on what happened, Damien interrupted, pulling out a folder from the inside of his suit jacket. The way he did it was deliberate, like he had been waiting for this moment. I pulled the preliminary reports from the arresting officers. Funny thing, the store clerk's testimony changed twice. First, she said she saw Imani take something. Then she said she only thought she did. Then she wasn't sure at all. A pulse of electricity ran through the room. The prosecutor went pale. And let's talk about your security guard, Damien continued, flipping to another page. A man with multiple excessive force complaints, a history of racial profiling, and, oh, look at that, a pending lawsuit for assaulting a black teenager outside the same store last year. Imani felt the shift in the air. A crack in the judge's confidence. A shift in the prosecutor's posture. The way the bailiff suddenly looked like he didn't want to be a part of this at all. This wasn't just a father defending his daughter anymore. This was a man dismantling a case, piece by piece, until there was nothing left standing. Judge Calloway exhaled slowly. He was trapped. But men like him didn't surrender. They found a way out. There are still grounds for, the only thing there are grounds for is a federal investigation into your courtroom, Damien interrupted, snapping the folder shut. Because I will be filing a motion to dismiss this case with prejudice, I will be escalating this to the Justice Department, and I will be ensuring that every single person who played a role in this charade is held accountable. His voice never rose. It didn't have to. Every word landed like a hammer, crushing the last remnants of credibility the prosecution had been clinging to. Judge Calloway's face turned a shade paler. The courtroom was silent now, an almost painful silence, thick with unspoken fear, realization, and something even deeper, the weight of consequences looming. Imani swallowed. Her heartbeat was a drum in her chest. She wasn't sure if she had ever breathed since her father had walked in. Every second had been a collision, a slow-motion wreck unfolding before her eyes. Judge Calloway cleared his throat, lifting the gavel slowly, as if stalling. Given these new concerns, he started, voice tight, forced, "This court will need to," then, a voice from the back of the room. Sharp. Unyielding. And absolute. "That won't be necessary." Heads turned. And when Imani saw who had spoken, her stomach dropped. Because if her father's entrance had shaken the courtroom, this was about to break it apart entirely. The courtroom was frozen in shock. The heavy wooden doors had burst open so violently that they slammed against the walls, sending an echo through the room. A tall man in a dark suit strode in, his presence commanding the attention of everyone. Damien Carter. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to shout. The sheer force of his arrival was enough to shift the entire atmosphere. His eyes locked onto Imani, his daughter, standing in chains like a common criminal, and for a split second, something flickered in his expression, something dangerous. Judge Calloway sat straighter, gripping his gavel like it was the only thing keeping him in power. His face twisted in irritation, but there was something else beneath it. Recognition. Fear. Damien Carter wasn't just a father. He was a high-ranking FBI agent. And this wasn't just a courtroom case anymore. It was about to become something much, much bigger. The bailiff, who had been reaching to secure the cuffs on Imani's wrists, hesitated. His eyes darted to the judge for direction, but before Calloway could speak, Damien's voice cut through the thick tension like a blade. "Take your hands off my daughter. Now." The entire room held its breath. The bailiff, uncertain, looked to the judge once more. Calloway's jaw tightened, but he forced a smirk onto his face, as if regaining some control. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "Agent Carter," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "Your daughter is in this courtroom as a defendant. I suggest you take a seat and let the law do its job." Damien didn't move. His eyes never left the bailiff, his voice unwavering. "You heard me. Take them off." A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Then, click, the sound of the cuffs unlocking. Imani's wrists were freed. She let out a shaky breath, rubbing at her skin where the cold metal had pressed too tight. The weight of humiliation still sat heavy on her chest, but her father's presence grounded her. She had seen him angry before, but never like this. Judge Calloway's smile faltered, but he forced his voice into something firm, authoritative. "This is highly irregular. Agent Carter, your daughter has been accused of theft." "Falsely accused," Damien interrupted. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned. "And I can prove it." The courtroom murmured. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. The store clerk and security guard, who had stood so confidently minutes ago, suddenly looked like cornered animals. Judge Calloway scoffed. "You have no grounds to. I have the security footage," Damien cut in smoothly. "The actual security footage. Not the conveniently missing one." He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen once, and turned it for the whole room to see. The video played. Clear as day. Imani in the store, not stealing a damn thing. The security guard staring at her from the corner, following her every move. Her pulling out her own phone from her own pocket. The moment he decided she was guilty. The room shifted. Uneasy murmurs rippled through the spectators. The prosecutor paled. The bailiff took a slow step back, his face unreadable. But it was Judge Calloway's reaction that mattered most. He went still. His fingers curled against the wooden desk in front of him, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that wasn't smugness or arrogance. It was panic. Damien tilted his head slightly, studying the judge. "You sentenced my daughter with no evidence, Calloway." "None." "Why is that?" His tone was almost too calm. Too calculated. "Is it because you don't need evidence when the defendant looks like her?" Judge Calloway's eyes flickered to the crowd, as if realizing they were watching him unravel. He straightened his spine, trying to regain control. This is absurd. That footage could be doctored. It's not, Damien said simply. And I have something even better. He reached into his suit pocket, pulling out a thick folder. He placed it on the judge's bench with a slow, deliberate movement. An ongoing federal investigation. Into you. The murmurs turned into gasps. Calloway stiffened. That's ridiculous. Damien's lips curved into a cold smile. Is it? He flipped the folder open, revealing stacks of documents, records, emails, wire transfers. Because this says otherwise. Fraudulent convictions. Bribery. Illegal sentencing quotas. Oh, and look at this, a disturbing trend of disproportionately convicting black teenagers at a significantly higher rate than their white peers. Would you like me to read some of these cases out loud? I'm sure the courtroom would love to hear how many lives you've destroyed. Imani's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't known about this. Hadn't realized this wasn't just about her anymore. Judge Calloway's face turned a sickly shade of gray. His lips parted slightly, as if searching for an excuse, an explanation, a way out. But there was none. Not this time. Damien leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You thought you could ruin my daughter's life because she was an easy target. Because she was just another black girl who wouldn't fight back. Because you thought no one would care. He let the words sink in, let the silence stretch. You were wrong. Judge Calloway opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Then, suddenly, the doors burst open again. 2 federal agents stormed in, their suits crisp, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a tall black woman with sharp eyes, held up an official warrant. Judge Robert Calloway, you are under arrest for corruption, abuse of power, and multiple violations of federal law. A stunned silence. Then, chaos. Calloway shot to his feet. This is a mistake. His voice cracked as the agents advanced. You can't do this. I'm a judge. And I'm a federal prosecutor, the woman shot back. And you're done. The room watched, frozen, as the once powerful judge was cuffed like a common criminal. The same way he had ordered Imani to be cuffed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As they dragged him away, he thrashed, eyes wild, spitting words that no longer held weight. This isn't over. This is an attack on the justice system. But even as he screamed, no one was listening. The same way he had never listened to the people who had begged for fairness, for decency, for their lives. Imani's knees nearly buckled. The sheer weight of what had just happened was too much to process all at once. She felt her father's hand on her shoulder, steadying her, grounding her. It's over, he murmured. She swallowed, emotions crashing over her. Relief. Anger. Justice. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could finally breathe. And as she watched Judge Calloway disappear through the doors, his fate sealed, she realized something. He had tried to break her. But in the end, he was the one who was truly destroyed. The air in the courtroom was thick, charged with something that felt too big to be contained within 4 walls. The once mighty Judge Calloway, the man who had held so much power in this space, was now being escorted away in handcuffs, his face drained of color, his arrogance stripped from him like a second skin. The sound of his protests had dulled into white noise. The very people who had once hung on to his words, who had nodded along with his rulings, now avoided his gaze, whispering among themselves. The predator had become the prey. Imani stood frozen, watching it all unfold, her hands gripping the edge of the defense table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The relief should have hit her all at once, should have flooded through her and drowned out everything else. But instead, there was this emptiness. A hollow space carved out by the fear, the humiliation, the raw injustice of what had just happened to her. Because even though Calloway was being taken away, even though the truth had shattered through his lies like a wrecking ball, the damage had already been done. Her father's voice pulled her out of the spiral. Imani. It was soft, but firm. A grounding force. She turned to him, eyes burning, her breath coming too fast. Damian Carter wasn't the kind of man who showed his emotions easily, but in that moment, the way he looked at her, his daughter, his baby girl, was enough to break something inside of her. She swallowed hard. They were really gonna lock me up, she whispered. They didn't care if I was innocent. They just, her throat closed up, and she looked away, blinking rapidly, trying to force back the tears that threatened to spill. If you hadn't come, you're okay, Damian interrupted, stepping closer, his hand resting on her shoulder. His grip was warm, steady, strong. You hear me? You're okay. But she wasn't. Not really. The prosecutor was still there, standing awkwardly at his table, shuffling his papers like he was hoping everyone would forget he had been part of this. Imani turned, her eyes locking onto him. You knew, she said, her voice quiet but sharp. You knew there was no case. You knew they had no evidence. And you still stood there and tried to put me away. The man shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. I was just following procedure. Imani let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking her head. You were about to ruin my life. You stood there, watched me cry, watched me beg, and you didn't even blink. Her voice wavered, but she refused to let it break. And you were fine with it. Because to you, I wasn't a person. I was just another case file. Another statistic to add to the pile, right? The prosecutor's mouth opened, but no words came out. Damian turned then, his gaze cutting through the man like a blade. You're going to be investigated too, he said flatly. Every case you've prosecuted under Calloway. Every sentence you pushed forward without question. Every single kid you threw away because it was easier than actually doing your job. His voice dropped lower, sharper. If I find out you were complicit in this corruption, you won't just lose your job. I will make sure you're held accountable for every life you destroyed. The prosecutor paled. At that moment, the store security guard, the one who had started all of this, tried to slip toward the door unnoticed. Imani's eyes snapped to him. Oh, no. You don't get to walk away, she said, her voice suddenly louder. The words stopped him in his tracks. He turned slowly, the arrogance that had been on his face the day he accused her now completely gone. Do you know what you did to me? Do you even care? She asked, stepping forward. You looked at me and decided I was a thief. You watched me plead for someone to listen, and you didn't care. You enjoyed it, didn't you? His jaw tensed. Look, I was just doing my job, your job. Imani's voice cracked with disbelief. Your job is to protect the store. Not to target black kids for no reason. Not to humiliate innocent people. Not to ruin lives because of some bias you probably don't even think you have. She took a breath, her whole body shaking now. You knew I didn't steal anything. You knew it, and you still called the police. And because of you, I was put in cuffs. Because of you, I almost went to jail. Because of you, I was made to feel like I was nothing. The security guard's eyes flickered toward Damian, toward the federal agents still standing nearby, toward the courtroom full of people watching him squirm. His bravado was gone. He swallowed hard. I didn't mean, you didn't mean to what? Imani pressed. Didn't mean to get caught. Didn't mean for this to blow up in your face. He had no answer. Damian exhaled, looking at his daughter with something like pride. Then, he turned to the agents. I assume he's being investigated too. One of them nodded. We've already been looking into racial profiling cases at the store. Now we have more than enough to proceed with legal action. The guard took a step back, panic flashing in his eyes. Wait, save it, one of the agents cut him off. You'll have plenty of time to explain yourself. In court. Imani watched as they led him away, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to erase what had happened. But at least, for once, someone like him would face consequences. Her mother rushed into the courtroom then, eyes frantic, scanning the room until she found her daughter. The moment she did, she practically ran to her, pulling Imani into a crushing embrace. "Baby, oh my God, I came as soon as I heard," her voice broke, and Imani felt her mother's hands shake as she clutched her tighter. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." For the first time, the tears finally fell. Imani buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her whole body trembling. She had been strong for so long, had fought so hard to keep herself together, but now, in her mother's arms, she could finally let go. Damien placed a hand on both of them, his own expression softening just enough to let his exhaustion show. "She's safe," he murmured. "That's what matters." But Imani knew it wasn't just about her. She wasn't the first black girl to be falsely accused. She wasn't the first to be treated like she was less than human. And unless things changed, she wouldn't be the last. She pulled back, wiping her face, her heart still pounding. Then she turned, looking around at everyone who had watched this unfold. The judge. The prosecutor. The clerk. The police officers. The onlookers who had sat in silence while they tried to throw her away. They would remember this day. And so would she. The weight of everything that had just happened pressed heavily on Imani's chest as she stepped out of the courtroom. The bright afternoon light hit her face, too sharp, too real, making it hard to believe that just moments ago, she had been standing at the edge of losing everything. The air outside felt different, like she had left one world and entered another. The world where she had been a defendant, a criminal, a problem was behind her, but the truth was, the scars of what happened in that room would not fade so easily. Her mother still held her close, one arm wrapped tightly around her shoulder, unwilling to let go just yet. There was a quiet desperation in the way she clung to her daughter, like she was trying to convince herself that Imani was still here, still whole, still hers. The raw emotion in her mother's grip made Imani's throat tighten. For the first time, she saw the pain on her mother's face, not just the relief that this nightmare was over, but the fear. The same fear black mothers carried every time their children walked out the door. Damien walked beside them, his movements deliberate, his expression unreadable. But Imani knew him well enough to see past his silence. His mind was still racing, still calculating, still holding on to everything that had almost happened. He had saved her. Had done what any father should do. But there was something in his eyes, a storm that hadn't yet settled. Imani took a slow breath, trying to steady herself, but her thoughts were tangled. Calloway was gone. The security guard was facing consequences. Justice, for once, had been served. And yet, why didn't it feel like enough? She turned to her father, her voice low, heavy with something she couldn't quite name. He was going to send me to jail. Without evidence. Without anything. Just because he could. Damien's jaw tightened. He didn't respond right away, and that silence was more telling than anything else. Imani felt the anger start to bubble again, a slow, simmering burn that she had tried to push down. How many other kids did he do that to? Her voice was sharper now, the weight of the realization pressing against her. How many didn't have someone to call? How many are sitting in a cell right now because of him? Damien exhaled, glancing away for a moment, as if trying to gather his thoughts. More than we'll ever know. The words landed like a punch. Imani clenched her fists. So what happens now? He's arrested, sure, but what about all the people he locked up? What about the lives he ruined? Does any of that get fixed? Her mother's hand squeezed her shoulder, a silent comfort, but Imani wasn't looking for comfort. She was looking for answers. Damien finally met her gaze. That's not something that happens overnight. Imani let out a bitter laugh. Right. Because the system isn't built to fix its mistakes. It's built to pretend they never happened. Damien's expression darkened, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. Her mother sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. Baby, I know how unfair this is. I know how much this hurts. But you being here right now. You being free. That's what matters. Imani shook her head. No. What matters is making sure this never happens to anyone else. She saw the flicker of something in her father's eyes, something proud, but also something guarded. He had spent his life in law enforcement, believing in the idea that justice could be served, that the system, while flawed, could be repaired from within. But now, standing here, watching his own daughter be forced to fight for her right to exist, she wondered if he still believed that. Damien inhaled slowly, choosing his next words carefully. You're right. What happened to you, it wasn't just a mistake. It was part of something bigger. Something that's been happening for generations. But I need you to understand something, Imani. You won today because I had the power to fight back. But there are so many people who never get that chance. His voice softened, but there was a sharp edge to it, a frustration buried beneath the calm. The system isn't broken. It was built exactly like this. The words hung between them. Imani already knew that. She had always known that. But hearing her father say it, an FBI agent, a man who had spent years believing in justice, in the law, in doing the right thing, made it feel more real. More impossible to ignore. She turned away, exhaling, trying to make sense of what came next. So what do we do? Damien's response was immediate. We keep fighting. She looked back at him, searching his face for more. And what if fighting isn't enough? For the first time since walking into that courtroom, Damien didn't have an answer. A long silence stretched between them, thick with everything that still felt unresolved. Her mother was the first to break it. Let's go home. The words were gentle, but firm. A reminder that, for now, they needed to breathe. Imani hesitated, glancing back at the courthouse, at the place that had nearly swallowed her whole. The building looked smaller now. Less powerful. Less terrifying. But she knew better than to think this was the end of anything. As they walked to the car, people were still staring. Some whispered, some looked away. But Imani didn't lower her gaze. She wasn't ashamed. She wasn't broken. She was angry. And she wasn't going to let that go. Her father opened the car door for her, his hand resting on the frame for a moment as she slid into the seat. Before closing it, he met her eyes. Imani, he said, his voice steady, this isn't over. She nodded, already knowing that. It never really was. The drive home was silent, but not the kind of silence that felt peaceful. It was thick, suffocating, loaded. The weight of everything that had happened still hung in the air like a storm that had passed but left behind wreckage. Imani sat in the back seat, staring out the window, watching the world move like nothing had changed, like her world hadn't just been turned upside down. Her reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, someone she barely recognized. She was free. She should feel relieved. But all she felt was raw, hollow, exhausted. Her mother's hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tight, knuckles pale against her deep brown skin. Damien sat in the passenger seat, his jaw set, his fingers drumming against his knee in that impatient, calculating way that told her his mind was still working. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The words sat heavy in Imani's chest, pressing against her ribs like they were fighting to escape. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. What happens now? Her voice cut through the silence, sharp, demanding. She didn't want comfort. She wanted answers. Her mother exhaled, like she'd been waiting for the question. Now, baby. We move forward. Imani let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Move forward. Just like that. Like none of this happened. She turned toward her father, her voice rising, thick with frustration. Like I wasn't almost sent to jail for nothing. Damien glanced back at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes unreadable. No one's saying that, Imani. Then what are you saying? Because right now, it feels like everyone just expects me to be grateful that I got out. But what about the next person? What about the people who didn't have you to show up for them? What about, her breath hitched, her throat closing up before she could force the rest out. Damien finally turned to face her, his voice low, steady, but carrying weight. I hear you. And I don't expect you to just let this go. But you have to understand something, this fight. It's bigger than today. It's bigger than Calloway. It's been happening for a long time, and it's not going to end overnight. Imani clenched her jaw, her fingers curling into fists in her lap. Then how do we make it end? Damien's silence stretched too long, his eyes flickering toward her mother like he was looking for help, for guidance, for anything that could make this easier. But there was no easy answer. Her mother sighed, glancing at Imani through the mirror. Baby, I know you want justice. I know you want this to mean something. And it will. But right now, you need time. You need to process this before you burn yourself out trying to fix the whole damn system by yourself. Imani shook her head, her throat burning. I don't want time. I want to do something. I can't just sit here knowing that there are kids like me who won't get a second chance. Her mother's voice softened, but her words were firm. You almost lost everything today. You deserve to take a second to breathe before you throw yourself into another battle. Imani turned back to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. She wanted to argue, wanted to scream, wanted to tell them that breathing wasn't enough. But the truth was, she was tired. Bone deep, soul-crushing tired. The car pulled into their driveway, the familiar sight of home standing before her like it was waiting to see if she still belonged here, if she was still the same person who had walked out of it that morning. But she wasn't. Something inside her had shifted, cracked, broken open. Damien was the first to step out, his movements too controlled, too measured, like he was keeping himself from exploding. Imani followed, her legs feeling like lead, her mother right behind her. The moment they stepped inside, the tension in the air snapped. Damien turned to face them, his eyes dark, stormy. This isn't over. Not for Calloway. Not for anyone else who let this happen. His voice was sharp, edged with something that almost sounded like guilt. I should have seen this coming. I should have known what kind of judge he was. I should have. He stopped, exhaling through his nose, rubbing a hand over his face. Imani stared at him, something clicking into place in her mind. You knew about him, didn't you? Damien's eyes flickered, and for the first time, he looked away. I suspected. A slow, bitter realization settled over her. And you didn't do anything? Her mother stiffened. Imani, no. The word burst from her, raw, desperate. He almost destroyed my life, and you knew he was dirty, and you, what? You waited? Damien's face hardened, but there was something in his expression that looked worn, like the weight of the system he had dedicated his life to was finally crushing him from the inside out. It's not that simple. Yes, it is. Her voice broke. It is that simple, Dad. You protect people. That's your job. And you let him do this. Not just to me, to who knows how many other kids. Damien's hands curled into fists at his sides, his voice dangerously low. You think I don't know that? You think I don't live with that? Every day, I work inside a system that I know is built to destroy us, and every day, I try to fight it without getting crushed myself. His breath was ragged now, his composure slipping. I thought I could do more from the inside. I thought I could change things. But today, I watched them try to take you. And I realized something, Imani, I've been playing by their rules for too long. The room was silent. Imani's heart pounded. So what are you gonna do? Damien took a long, slow breath, his eyes steady now, filled with something deadly, relentless. I'm gonna tear it all down. Imani's breath hitched. Her mother sucked in a sharp breath. Damien, no. His voice was final, unshakable. This ends now. Imani had never seen her father like this. Not just angry. Determined. Focused in a way that felt dangerous, but also like it was the only thing he could do. For the first time, she saw him not just as her father, not just as an agent, but as a man who had spent his life choosing between survival and justice. And now, he was done choosing. Imani swallowed, her pulse hammering. Then I'm in. Her mother's eyes widened. Baby, no, I'm in, Imani repeated, stepping forward, meeting her father's gaze. If we're doing this, I'm not sitting on the sidelines. I don't care what it takes. I don't care how long it takes. I want them to pay. All of them. A long, heavy pause stretched between them. Then, for the first time that day, Damien smiled. Not a warm smile. Not a comforting smile. A dangerous one. Then let's get to work. The air in the house was electric, charged with something Imani had never felt before. It wasn't just anger. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was determination, sharp and unyielding. It settled in her bones, in the way she stood, in the way she refused to shrink anymore. For the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't just reacting to what had been done to her, she was taking control. Her father sat at the dining table, his laptop open, his phone in his hand, but his mind somewhere else entirely. His movements were sharp, deliberate. Damien Carter was a man who had spent years playing within the system, trying to make changes from the inside. But now, he was done waiting. He wasn't speaking yet, but Imani could see it in his eyes. The quiet calculation. The weight of every decision he was about to make. Her mother stood by the counter, arms crossed, tension radiating from her body. She had spent all day being the one trying to hold them together, but even she had a limit. When she spoke, her voice was low, measured, but it carried the weight of a mother who had nearly lost her child. Tell me you're thinking this through, Damien. Her father didn't look up. I am. Are you? Her mother's voice wavered, her nails digging into her arms. Because the way you're acting right now, it doesn't seem like you're thinking. It seems like you're ready to go to war. Damien exhaled through his nose, finally meeting her gaze. Because I am. The words landed between them like a thunderclap. Imani held her breath. Her mother's lips parted, but for a moment, no words came. Then she shook her head. And then what? Her voice cracked, frustration laced into every syllable. You take them all down, expose everything, then what? You think that'll fix anything? You think that'll make it so this never happens again? Damien's jaw clenched. I think it's a start. A start to what? Her mother's voice grew sharper, edged with fear, exhaustion, anger, all the things she had been holding in for too long. You think I don't want justice, Damien? You think I don't want to burn this whole damn system to the ground after what they did to our daughter? Her voice broke on the last word, and she pressed a trembling hand to her temple, inhaling sharply. But I can't lose you. I won't. And I won't lose her either. Imani felt those words in her chest, a weight pressing down on her ribs. I'm not asking you to lose me, Damien said, his voice calmer now, but still filled with something unbreakable. I'm asking you to trust me. Her mother let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. That's not fair. It's not about fair, Damien shot back, standing now, his hands on the table. None of this is. What happened to Imani wasn't fair. The kids sitting in jail cells right now because of Calloway weren't given a fair chance. And you know damn well that if I hadn't been there today, we would have lost her. Forever. Silence swallowed the room whole. Imani swallowed hard, stepping forward. I need this, she whispered. I need to do something. I can't just pretend this didn't happen. I can't just go back to school like everything's normal. It's not normal. She looked at her mother then, her voice cracking, her hands shaking at her sides. Mom, they were going to take me away. I was begging for them to believe me, and no one did. No one cared. Her mother's face crumbled, pain flashing across her expression like a wound torn open. I'm scared, Imani admitted, her voice breaking. I'm scared because I know this isn't just about me. I know that for every one of me that gets out, there are dozens who don't. And I don't know how to live with that. I don't know how to walk back into my life knowing that I got lucky because I had a father with power, because I had a last name that meant something. I should have never had to rely on that in the first place. Damien's gaze softened just slightly, but his stance remained firm. Her mother exhaled sharply, blinking back tears. You shouldn't have. You're right. But baby, she stopped, biting her lip, looking away like she was trying to find the right words. I just don't want this to eat you alive. Imani let out a shuddering breath. It already has. Her mother closed her eyes. Damien spoke then, his voice steadier than anyone else's in the room. This isn't just about Calloway. He was part of something bigger. This is about the prosecutors who let it happen. The cops who looked the other way. The system that made it possible in the first place. And I'm not just going to let that stand. Her mother shook her head. And you think they're just going to let you take them down? You think there won't be consequences? Of course there will be, Damien said. But I'm not afraid of them. Imani met his eyes then, something passing between them. Something stronger than fear. Her mother exhaled, rubbing her temples. I just want my family safe. That's all I want. Damien stepped forward, pressing a hand to her shoulder. I want that too. But safety means nothing if it's built on silence. Imani knew then, without a doubt, that this was bigger than just them. This wasn't just about her arrest. This was about every black kid who had been shoved through the system like they were disposable. This was about power. Corruption. A system designed to break them before they even had a chance to fight back. She didn't know what the future looked like. She didn't know how much they would uncover, how far they would have to go. But she knew one thing for sure. They weren't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The months that followed were nothing short of a battle. What started as a fight for Imani's own justice quickly became something much larger. Damien had spent years working within the system, trying to make a difference from the inside. But after what happened to his daughter, he finally saw it for what it truly was, a machine designed to crush people like her before they even had a chance to fight back. And he wasn't going to stand for it any longer. The investigation into Judge Calloway had exploded in the media. What started as a corruption case against one man soon unraveled into something much deeper, exposing a network of judges, prosecutors, and police officers who had been working together for years, targeting black and brown teenagers, pushing for harsher sentences, covering up wrongful convictions, and filling private detention centers for their own profit. Calloway wasn't just a bad judge. He was part of a system that thrived on destroying lives. And now, that system was finally crumbling. Imani watched as one by one, the people who had nearly taken everything from her fell. The prosecutor who had stood there, trying to send her away without evidence, was forced to resign when it was revealed that he had knowingly pursued false charges in dozens of cases. The security guard who had started it all was fired, blacklisted from working in law enforcement ever again, and sued by multiple families who had been wrongfully accused and harassed under his watch. Every single case Calloway had ever ruled on was reopened, investigated, and in many cases, overturned. People who had lost years of their lives to his corruption were finally getting their freedom back. But that wasn't enough for Imani. She didn't just want Calloway gone. She wanted him to understand what it felt like to have everything ripped away from him the way he had done to so many others. And she got exactly what she wanted. The day his sentencing was announced, Imani sat in the courtroom, the same courtroom where he had once ruled over her fate so easily, so carelessly. This time, he wasn't sitting on the bench. He was standing in the defendant's chair, wrists cuffed, face pale, his usual arrogance replaced with dread. The irony of it all wasn't lost on anyone. The judge read out the charges: corruption, bribery, obstruction of justice, false imprisonment, conspiracy. The list went on and on. And when the final sentence was given, 25 years with no possibility of parole, Calloway finally understood what it felt like to be trapped in a system that had already decided his fate long before he had a chance to fight back. Imani never looked away. Not when he turned to scan the room, searching for someone, anyone, who still had power left to save him. Not when his face twisted with rage, then fear, then the crushing realization that no one was coming for him. She met his eyes, held his gaze, and let him see it, the victory, the strength, the justice. She had won. As they dragged him away, his voice cracked with desperation, spitting excuses, protests, pleas for mercy. But nobody listened. Nobody cared. Just like he had never cared when those same cries came from the people he had sentenced. Imani walked out of the courtroom that day with her head held high, her heart lighter than it had been in months. But she knew this wasn't over. Not for her. The system that had almost swallowed her whole wasn't going to fix itself. And she refused to let her story be just another headline that would fade in time. She took her pain, her fear, her rage, and she turned it into something unstoppable. With the help of her father and a team of lawyers, activists, and reporters, she created an organization dedicated to exposing wrongful convictions, fighting for juveniles trapped in the system, and tearing down the corruption that had almost destroyed her life. She started speaking, standing in front of crowds of young people who had been told their voices didn't matter, telling them that they did matter, that they could fight, that they could win. And they did. One case at a time, one battle at a time, one victory at a time. Her father was right, this fight wasn't going to end overnight. But now, she was part of it. She wasn't just another victim of the system. She was a force against it. And as for Calloway, Imani had seen the reports from prison. He had tried to hold on to the same power he once had, but there was no judge's bench to protect him now. No corrupt officers in his pocket. No courtroom where he was the one in control. Now, he was just another inmate. And the people around him? They knew exactly who he was. Imani didn't need revenge. She didn't need to see what happened to him behind those walls. She already knew. She had learned a long time ago that justice always comes. Maybe not when you expect it. Maybe not the way you imagined. But it comes. And this time, it had come for him. Now, let's talk about it. How many times have we heard stories like this? How many times has someone been falsely accused, thrown into a system that wasn't built for them to escape? How many people didn't have someone to call, didn't have a father with power, didn't have a second chance? Imani's story had a different ending because she was lucky. But luck should never be the reason someone gets justice. Justice should be a right. So, what do you think? Should we just accept that this is the way the world works, or should we fight to change it? Should we let stories like Imani's fade into the background, or should we make sure that every single person who has been wrongfully convicted gets the justice they deserve? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's have this conversation. And if you want more stories like this, stories that expose the truth, stories that challenge the way things are, hit that subscribe button and join us here on Tales of Twist. Because trust me, there are plenty more stories to tell.